Welcome to the gallery talk on Galileo's World, an Artful Observation of the Cosmos. I didn't realize how long the title was until I had to pronounce it. This exhibit, as you probably already know, is the Fred Jones section of the campus-wide exhibit Galileo's World, which has three other venues. One at the History of Science collection at the Basel Library, a 2-minute walk from here. Another one at the Sam Noble Museum of Natural History, here on campus, and a third one at the Weather Center, also on campus. Each venue explores a different aspect of Galileo's impact on the world, and they're all very, very good exhibit, and I would strongly encourage you to see them. They're all very close by, which is why we love Norman, right? This exhibit in particular, the Fred Jones section, examines the connections between art and science on several levels, but in particular in regards to the role that Galileo's artistic formation had in his ability to not only craft the telescope, but also recognize the so-called strange spottedness of the moon, so these light and dark patches visible to the naked eye on the surface of the moon, as indeed mountains and craters, so elevations and depressions. And we will see how his artistic formation allowed him to make that discovery. The exhibit is divided in 3 sections. The first section right here will take us to the environments of the Academy of Design in Florence, which Galileo attended as both a student and a professor. It includes treatises on topics like optics, linear perspective, human proportions, chiaroscuro, so the handling of light and shadows, all literature that would have informed Galileo and that would have constituted the formation, the education of artists and scientists alike within the environment of the Academy. We will also see Renaissance works from the permanent collection of the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art on display. The second section will take us to the moon, I guess, and it will explore the impact that Galileo's Lunar Studies had on the following, the following astronomers and also artists. And it will include the main lunar treatises of the following 2 centuries, and also some of the coolest contemporary works from the permanent collection of the Fred Jones, in particular works by 2 artists, Nesbitt and McCall, who were employed by NASA as official artists to the Apollo missions of the 60s and 70s. The third section and final section will take us to will explore the impact that Galileo's discoveries, cosmological discoveries in general, but in particular discoveries of new stars, had on the collective imagination, and how it opened up this world of potentially infinite, although the concept of infinity was not there yet, world of stars. And it will explore in particular the so-called golden age of star atlases. And we will see some of the most impressive star atlases, together with some contemporary and Renaissance works from the permanent collection. But let's talk about the star of the exhibit, of course, the Siderius Nuncius, or Starry Messenger, this very little and very powerful pamphlet, which was published, written of course by Galileo in Latin, published in 1610, under the tutelage of Cosimo II of the Medici family, perhaps the most powerful man in Italy after the Pope at that point. And I should say this volume, like all the volumes that you will see in the exhibit, come from the special collection of the History of Science at the University of Oklahoma. This volume in particular is extremely rare because it is the only copy of the Siderius Nuncius that carries handwriting of Galileo Galilei. Up until not too long ago, there was another copy which turned out to be a forgery, so we rejoice from that, and now we are the only owners of a copy signed and handwritten by Galileo. And in case you're wondering, that is a dedication to an Italian poet, Gabriello Chiabrera, lots of R rolling there. It was his Galileo's way to ask the poet to write an introductory poem to the Italian version of the Sidereus Nuncius. So Galileo wanted to publish it in Italian so that it would reach a wider audience. However, the Sidereus Nuncius was an instant bestseller. So it made him incredibly famous, incredibly well-known throughout Europe. This is not the book that got him in trouble. That will happen in 1633, this is 1610, with the dialogue of the two world chief systems. At this point, he was still safe. He was under the tutelage of Cosimo II. Galileo had not seen a telescope before crafting his own device. The telescope had been invented 2 years before in 1608 in Holland. And it made its way to Italy in the form of a traveling curiosity, the thing that people would pull out of a bag and show in the streets. A friend of Galileo's saw the telescope, made some sketches, and brought them to Galileo. Simply based on those sketches, Galileo realized, based on the knowledge that he had acquired at the Academy, that the telescope was based on optics. And so he taught himself the art of lens crafting from scratch, and he built his own telescope, which of course not only had a larger magnifying power, but it also solved one of the major problems of the original telescope, which delivered upside down images. You realize that by placing two concave lenses next to each other, he could deliver right side up images. And that was the so-called, so he invented the so-called Galilean telescope. Not only did he do all of that, he did something that no one in the 2 previous years had thought of doing. He turned the telescope to the skies. And by doing that, if someone had done it, we don't have any written testimony of that. And by doing that, he applied technology to the generating of new knowledge about our world and about our cosmos. Up until that point, the telescope had been used mostly for militaristic purposes, to spot a ship, for instance. So what did he see in the skies? First of all, he saw that the moon had craters and mountains. So the moon was not this pristine and pure celestial body that Aristotle wanted us to believe. He also saw 4 satellites of Jupiter. He realized that the Milky Way was a conglomerate of stars, and that the 7 sisters of the Pleiades constellation were many more than 7 sisters. So he discovered these stars, and he observed the phases of Venus and the sunspot. All of these discoveries put together seem to point out to the heliocentric system or theory of the world, according to which the sun is at the center, as a much more plausible theory of the cosmos. Why? Well, because if the moon had craters and it was not this perfectly spherical body, all orbiting bodies were believed to be perfect. But if an orbiting body was not perfect, then the Earth, which had craters, might have been in turn an orbiting body. It's not accurate science, but intuitively it seemed to make sense. The fact that Jupiter, which was an orbiting body, had its own satellites, made it more plausible to see the Earth as an orbiting body with its own satellite, the moon. So Galileo immediately realized of the magnitude of these discoveries and quickly assembled a compendium of them in the form of this very light pamphlet, the Sidereus Nuncius, which of course, like I said, was an instant bestseller. But now, let's see what of his artistic formation informed his discoveries, and let's go to Florence and to the environments of the Academy.
Excuse me, yes, this is rather nitpicky question. Can I just get the dates straight? So you say 1613 is the date when Galileo was admitted to the Academy of Design, right? Mm-hmm. But the Sidereus Nuncius was 1610.
1610.
Right. So was he trained before?
He was trained before. That is the year in which he was admitted as a professor. As a teacher. Right. So the Academy. The Academy of Design in Florence was founded by artist Giorgio Vasari, under the tutelage of Cosimo I of the Medici family, so a generation before. And Giorgio Vasari had this very ambitious intellectual plan to create an environment for the academy, within the walls of the academy, where artists and philosophers and scientists alike could have a conversation and inform each other's work in that way. His ultimate goal was to raise the social status of artists from the condition of mere artisans, as they were seen up until that point, to the social status of intellectuals. And he succeeded in that. The Academy was a very, by the time Galileo joined as a student, it was a very prestigious institution, and it did offer all of that. Like I said, Galileo joined as a student. He began taking lessons in perspective and chiaroscuro, so the handling of light and shadow, from painter and a friend, older member of the Academy, Ludovico Cigoli, who very soon began to laud him for his draftsman skills and call him his own master. So Galileo obviously had a natural inclination, a propensity to art. And that allowed him to become a geometer in 1613. So a professor, a teacher of perspective and chiaroscuro for the younger students, which was quite an achievement for a then relatively young Galileo. But let's see what in this education, this formation, informed his discoveries. And let's talk about the shadow. The shadow was had not been depicted in art for almost 8 centuries. It was not a concern during the Middle Ages. At this time, during the Renaissance, with this renewed interest in an accurate, realistic portrayal of reality, more or less, shadows became a very interesting natural phenomenon. And so artists and scientists alike were very interested in the shadow. And don't forget that drawing was a very important tool in the hands of scientists also, because a sketch or a drawing of your own discovery allows you to make sense of what you have just done, and not only that, but also to pass it on to the following generations. The study of the shadow is obviously a study in perspective and also in optics, so in the study of how light travels. And this was a very big concern in the Academy, studies in perspective and optics. And here we have Leon Battista Alberti, Opuscoli Morali, where the humanist Leon Battista Alberti comes up with the so-called Albertus Window, which was a way to accurately portray a perspectival scenery, so a perspectival portrayal of a landscape. Albertus Window consisted in a frame that held a transparent veil stretched with a grid, marked with a grid, and that would be placed on the window. That made for the artist, a tracing of each square on the grid, on the paper, on the support, much more easy. And so that was a step, not the first step, we had Brunelleschi's mirror before them, but one of the first steps into this accurate portrayal. From Leon Battista Alberti, who was interested in many other phenomena of optics, so he was interested in the study of optics in general, we have Albert Dürer, Institutionem Geometricarum, where he proposes a variety of revisions of Albertus Window. And whenever you have a chance to get close, you can see how he's proposing this method where you pull a string from one point of the object to the eye of the viewer, and in doing that, you perforate a screen that's in the middle, placed in between, and you come up with this outline of holes, basically, of the object. It's an incredibly difficult method, but he's really trying to come up with a more precise way to portray, to have accurate perspectival portrayal. And, this really tells you how the attempt to make mathematical and geometrical sense of all of this. And this is one of the best. So this method worked especially for very difficult perspectives, sort of challenging perspectives like this one, where the loop is seen frontwise. But let's move on to another important volume that I want to point your. Oh, let's go that way. Sorry. Luca Pacioli's Divina Proporzione, or Divine Proportion, where you really see where Galileo got his idea of the craters in the mountains on the moon. This is a study in, again, perspective. Pacioli placed particular attention on the effect of the light, of the raking light, over volumetric bodies. And this is the kind of image. These are all volumes that were studied at the Academy. Some of these humanists were teachers at the Academy. This is the kind of image that would have informed Galileo. Based on what we know on his telescope, we can assume that the images the telescope delivered were not as clear. Were not clear enough for him to make this immediate association between the patchiness, the light and shadow on the moon, and the craters. It is thanks to this knowledge, this visual patrimony that he had, that he was able to recognize that. The Divina Proporzione is surrounded here by some engravings, studies of human proportions. The reason for that being that there was believed to be a divine proportion, as sort of a hidden number behind everything that had been created by God, and that we could somehow access that number, that basic proportion, in both the study of shadows or the study of human proportions. Now let's move to Leonardo da Vinci, who's also present here. We're very excited about that, with his Trattato della Pittura, or on painting, where he really moves beyond the geometric application of perspective into more pictorial concerns. And he introduces concepts, for instance, like the atmospheric perspective, or I think it's called aerial perspective in English as well, according to which when there is air between us and an object observed, so if an object is closer to us, it should be depicted with a clearer outline, whereas if farther away object should look somewhat blurry. So Galileo is telling us, well, positioning the object in the right place is important, but also how we paint it is important, and how clear it looks to our eyes. So he had more pictorial concerns, very important. One of the things that one of the most fascinating things that Leonardo discusses in his treatise on painting is the so-called secondary light effect. What is that? So a source of light hits an object and creates, of course, a well-lit area and a shaded area. However, it also hits the floor, or a third body, and the light from here reflects back to the object and creates this relatively lighter portion within the shaded area of the object. That is called the secondary light effect. And it is a phenomenon that Leonardo has studied from the pictorial point of view. Leon Battista Alberti has studied from the pictorial point of view. But it is this concept that Galileo applied to the moon. So people had at that point explained this lighter portion of the shaded area of the moon in various ways. One of them being the ability of the moon to generate its own light. Galileo looked at the telescope, applied this knowledge that he had acquired in the Academy, and said, no, that's a secondary light effect. That is the sun hitting the Earth, and from the Earth hitting the moon, and creating this relatively light area on the shaded portion of the moon, which is amazing. I love this. So this is an enlargement from the Trattato della Pittura. We also have Sirigatti, La pratica di prospettiva, another very important volume in the Academy. He was a professor of perspective who really goes a step forward from Luca Pacioli, Divine Proportion. And the presence of crosses here I don't think is coincidental, because at this point perspective was very much tied with religion. It is a very Renaissance introduction, but in many ways, in the way in which it was tied to this sort of divine intervention, sometimes reaching levels of esotericism, it is really quite medieval in many ways. And we have a good example of that. We have the work of Atanassus right here, where he explores the camera obscura, so this box where the light enters and it becomes reversed on the other side. He sees Atanassus, which is a very useful tool that Galileo, for instance, used in his observation of the moon. Kircher at this point is seeing the camera obscura as a sign of the divine intervention. So it is a sign of God. There's the idea that God created light on the first day. Why? Well, because before, without light we wouldn't be able to see anything, right? So, and that idea, it goes back to that idea, and the fact that we could grasp the geometrical truth behind the way in which light travels, gave people the idea that that could be a way to access God's plan of creation. And Kircher sees parallels also in these strange shapes that we see maybe in rocks, strange formations, and tree trunks. So he's really taking it a little too far into something esoteric, but it gives you a good idea of how perspective was still tied with religion and with esotericism in many ways. We have another little bitty volume that is enlarged here at the entrance, Niccolò Tartaglia's treatise, where, and you can see it here, you can see it enlarged probably better on the entrance wall, where perspective is in this environment, circular, walled environment. At the gate of it, there's Euclid, the father of geometry, and then Perspectiva is there among other disciplines and is superseded, I guess, by philosophy. So that tells you how important philosophy was at this point. And then there is another enlargement that I think speaks of that, of the connection with the divine intervention that is in the moon section. So we'll fly to the moon now and look at Francesco Fontana's Nove Celestium Terrestrumque Rerum Observationes. Yes, and this is one of his lunar studies. And here, perspective is represented in a sort of a philosophical dialogue with architecture, with philosophy, with poetry, with cosmography, geometry, mathematics, astrology. So she's one of the main people, the main disciplines. She's holding a mirror, which is a symbol of an allegory of self-awareness. She's holding a book of Ptolemy, 2nd century BC, supporter of the geocentric system, where the Earth is at the center. And she's wearing a pendant with the divine eye, which tells you how the idea of perspective was connected to the idea of truth and the idea of God's plan of creation. So now we are in the lunar section that, like I said, explores the effects that Galileo's lunar discoveries had on the following astronomers and artists. So in the immediate aftermath of his discoveries, a number of artists and scientists apply themselves with varying degrees of competence to the portrayal, the mapping of the moon. It was really quite the race to the moon, in a sense, to the visual exploration of the moon. And we can start with British astronomer William Gilbert in the Mundo Nostro Sublunari, where he, for the first time, applies geographical terms that were employed, for the description of formation on Earth, earthly formation, to the moon. As you can see, the drawing is very simple, and I would encourage you to actually see what I'm talking about. The formations are very, the drawings are very simple, and they give you a sense of how his interest was mostly geographical rather than astronomical. There's also an element of colonialism. He's naming one of the lands Britannia, which is the Latin name for Great Britain. So he's claiming in a sort of, manifest destiny of a sort, the moon. But what is really, I think, telling you is that British astronomers really lack that draftsmanship, that ability to draw that Italian astronomers had, that Italian humanists had, thanks to their academic, their upbringing, their education in an institution like the Academy of Design in Florence. But from here, we can move to the, let's see, who's the next one? Oh, Johannes Savellius, Selenographia, or study of the moon. This is an interesting image. In this image, the most important Arab scholar in regards to lunar studies, Ibn al-Haytham, is represented on the left, and he's standing on a pedestal-like structure over the image of the plate of a head and the word razione, which means reason. On the other side, there is Galileo, of course, telescope in his hand, on a similar structure with the image of an eye and the word sensu, which means through senses. So what Johannes Savellius is trying to say is that the very inductive and often circular philosophy of the Aristotelian natural history, of which al-Haytham was in many ways a follower, needed to be combined with this new kind of a way to look at the world, which was based on the senses. Of course, reasoning was very much involved. It was still a rational way to look at the world, but it was based on the senses, which means it was based on observation. Very important innovation. And according to Johannes Savellius, he's the one who's, of course, combining. He's not very modest. He's combining these two sort of ways of thinking about the discovery of, scientific discovery in general, and visions of the world. Of course, there is contemplation, parting the clouds of ignorance. We have on one side, we have the sun represented with the sunspots that Galileo discovered, and on the other side there's the moon with its craters in the Galilean moon. And Savellius really was the first one who attempted a very difficult undertaking. He attempted to portray the moon as accurately as possible, so to deliver the most accurate map of the moon. He introduced a nomenclature that remained valid until the 18th century, which was quite a long time. However, his nomenclature will be replaced by Riccioli, who we will meet in a minute. But Savellius was mostly renowned for his cosmological discoveries in general. In fact, we will see his firmamentum in the starry section of the exhibit. He had the best equipped observatory at the time in Europe. He crafted the best lenses. He had the most powerful telescopes. So he was well respected for that. And his observatory was on the rooftop of his house, which is really cool. And he used this very successful brewery to finance the observatory, which is a good way to put beer to good use. Not that it's not used already. No. He's in Holland. Yeah, Poland. Sorry. And so now we can move to Giambattista Riccioli, and this is probably the most fascinating image, to me at least, in the exhibit. Giambattista Riccioli, like I said, introduced a new nomenclature of the moon. His nomenclature, so his names of the regions of the moon are still adopted today, to this day. So very successful. He introduced things like figures of other astronomers and very relevant imagery to his contemporaries. But he also attempted to do something even more difficult, even more daunting in a way. He tried to come up with a theory, with an encompassing theory of all the cosmos, which was no easy task and that no one really did. In fact, he titles his work Almagestum Novum, so New Almagestum. The Almagestum was Ptolemy's work on the cosmos. So Ptolemy's comprehensive theories of the cosmos of the 2nd century BC. This image is, I think, a very good expression of how confused the Church of the Counter-Reformation was at this point in history. And it is incredibly fascinating. Compositionally, it's very crowded, as you can tell. There is a very unlikely combination of mythological figures, scientific figures. There is, on the left, we have Panoptes, I can't think of his name right now, Argus Panoptes, who was a mythological figure. He was sent by Hera, the wife of Zeus, to keep an eye on one of the many women that Zeus wanted, and which is a very unlikely presence in this book. But he, at this point, was associated with the starry sky, but still a forced presence. On the right side, there is Urania, the muse of astronomy, and she's holding the scale and she's measuring, she's weighing the two world systems. One, the Ptolemaic system, the Copernicus system, so according to which the sun was at the center of the universe, and then the system by Tycho Brahe, another huge astronomer who is not really present in the exhibit, only in the form of a citation from Riccioli, who was proposing an alternative to the heliocentric system, while trying still to make sense of the apparent motions of the planets. So everybody was really trying at this point to keep the Earth at the center of the universe, because that is what Aristotle said, while at the same time making sense of these visual discrepancies. And so it's a very difficult time for Giambattista Riccioli, who is a Jesuit scholar, and like all Jesuits, he was incredibly knowledgeable. He considered himself the defender of the church at this point. And he was trying to really, really hard to make sense of all of this. By the scale, there's a phrase, "it will not tip for all time," which we don't know exactly what that refers to, the heliocentric system or the Tycho Brahe system, which Riccioli offered an ulterior revision of. One is lower, so seems to have more weight, and yet the other one is higher, so it's closer to God. So it is a kind of a contradictory image in those terms. Ptolemy is on the ground, looking kind of defeated, and he's saying, "My system is raised up while revised, while corrected." So he's talking about raising up the system, yet his system is down. This image really doesn't make much sense. It's a very intricate image, a very interesting image that I think speaks of that confusion. And with that, we can move to the next section, Mapping the Heavens. I think that volume is a good bridge to this other section, which, like I said, explores the impact that Galileo's discoveries of the new stars had on the collective imagination. But we start the section with Nicolaus Copernicus' De Revolutionibus, So his treatise on the revolutions of the bodies, the celestial bodies. Copernicus was a staunch Aristotelian. He was trying really hard to get rid of an aspect of the geocentric system as it was proposed by Ptolemy in the 2nd century BC, which he considered very anti-Aristotelian, the equant. We will not talk about that. But what it's important to realize is that when he came up with this book, he did not want to contradict the Aristotelian system. He was an Aristotelian himself. But he was trying to, like I said, everybody was confused at this point. He was trying to really make sense of things. And so he published this book. This is in Poland, territory of the Catholic Church. He dedicated it to the Pope, so very non-controversial. The Pope actually, the Church actually covered the printing press costs. And he felt very, very self-aware about this book, because in order to get rid of the equant, his very anti-Aristotelian, imaginative way to explain discrepancy, he had placed the sun at the center of the universe as a kind of an option, something to explore. This book was not a bestseller. It was written in Latin, very dry Latin. It has a few charts and not very appealing illustrations. It was what he did for others that matters. The road that paved to people like Galileo Galilei and to his own student, Kepler, who is, of course, the first modern scientist. Galileo was never like Copernicus. He was always anti-Aristotelian. There were a number of Aristotelian principles that he never accepted. And of course, he always grasped the heliocentric system. He always knew that the sun was at the center of the universe. He just did not know how to present it to the world without getting in trouble. After the Siderius Nuncius, he still had the protection of Cosimo II, of the Medici family. Cardinal Bellarmine, who was the most powerful man after the Pope in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, told him to warn him to keep his mouth shut. He said, you can hold on to your beliefs after the Siderius Nuncius, but you cannot in any way publish them and diffuse them to others. Of course, that's exactly what Galileo did. In 1633, he published a dialogue of the two world chief systems, in which he proposes the heliocentric theory. And even though he puts a disclaimer at the end and says, well, this is just a philosophical hypothesis, really Aristotle is right, the way he presented it got him in trouble. It was a dialogue between three figures. One of the figures was by the name of Simplicio, simpleton, and he delivered basically the opinions of Pope Urban VIII, who was Galileo's friend, but who was also in the meantime had become the Pope, and so could obviously not allow for that. And so Galileo got in trouble. He could not be imprisoned. He was too well known for that. He was known throughout Europe as the best astronomer at that point. He still had the protection of powerful people, but he was confined to his house where he eventually died. So Galileo's discoveries of the stars is what elicits this race to the mapping of the stars that we will see. And in this section, we will explore the so-called golden age of the star atlas, a time in which an attention to a precise and accurate location of stars, so a very scientific approach, is combined and paralleled by a very strong aesthetic interest in the representations of the constellations. We start with Alessandro Piccolomini, delle Stelle Fisse. This is before Galileo, and he's the first one who really gets rid of constellations and focuses simply on accurate locations of stars. Then we have here a re-edition, of course, of Ptolemy's portions of Ptolemy's Almagestum, so his theory of the cosmos. Ptolemy had created star charts. He never created an atlas. But based on the star charts, some atlases were made, like this one, which is based on Albertus woodcut, so it's an engraving, and you have all the main constellations, the ones that we recognize, Taurus, Gemini, Sagittarius, and so on, in contemporary clothing. But this is important because Ptolemy came up with 48 constellations, which will be the nucleus of what will become our constellations today. So they're still in use today, to this day. We're walking by Johann Bayer's Uranometria, one of the first of the 4 most important star atlases in the golden age of star atlas. Please notice the oil painting by Hendrik de Klerk, which from 1600, which represents Andromeda and Perseus and the sea monster Cetus. We will talk about that pretty soon. Treatise or Star Atlas, one of also the main 4 star atlases, and we have the final 2 here, Bode and Flamsteed. So constellations, of course, have always been an interest throughout history. All people had this tendency to associate star patterns to certain figures. Some of them are very recognizable, like everybody can recognize Scorpion in the constellation of Scorpio. And some are so recognizable that more than one region of the world at the same time sees the same thing, tends to see the same thing in the constellation. For instance, that's the case of Orion, which is almost always seen as a man, a human figure, holding a shield and a weapon in the other hand and about to hit someone. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you really need a stretch of the imagination to see these figures. It makes you wonder what Greeks were up to when they came up with these constellations. I did find out that they were the largest consumers of wine between the 2nd and 3rd century. I don't know if that's a coincidence. And they experimented with mushrooms as well. So you can see all kinds of things in the sky. But so there's always this tendency in history. And by the 15th century, with the exploration of the southern hemispheres by Portuguese and Spanish, these new constellations began to appear. Of course, they had their own names given to them by the native population, but those were utterly ignored. And Europeans tried to find new names for these constellations. Some of them were good and they worked. Some of them not so much. We have here, Johannes Savellius' Firmamentum, where he is. You can come a little closer so you can see the books and kind of memorize the image. Johannes Savellius, always very modest, these astronomers, is kneeling towards a tribunal of great astronomers, and he's presenting his two new proposed constellations for the southern hemisphere, the sextant and the shield, which are actually still in use today because, well, they really look like a shield and a sextant. So that worked. This is a very Baroque image with the puttae and the banners, all the animals, all the constellations in the form of animals are approaching Savellius. So that worked, but that was not always the case. And we have, for example, John Borris' Uranographia from 1801, which is the last one of the 4 main star atlases, where he's proposing these very unlikely but fun constellations like the Montgolfier balloon, the electric generator, the cat, which surprisingly is not in the skies. There's several dogs, but no one, I'm sure the Egyptian had thought about having a cat, but apparently Europeans never did that. And so these constellations, which are very fun, but they never caught on because they were too difficult to recognize. At some point, an exponent of the Protestant church complained about the mythological figures in the sky, and he thought they offended his Protestant sensibilities, and so he proposed a new set of figures to replace the old ones from the Bible. And so we have St. Helen with the cross, which I think is still somewhat in use today, you know, the evangelists Mark and Luke and so on. But the problem with these new constellations was that the people proposing them were really missing the point of the constellation, which is a way to easily recognize a pattern in the sky. So they were so concerned with, you know, with attaching a meaning to the sky, and they forgot the whole point. Constellations were very important aids in navigation, of course. They still are. Sometimes satellites do fail us. They were also used as a signal of the advent of a season, with all of the very important practical ramifications of that in terms of, you know, crops and the working of the land. And we have two engravings just around the corner in the same section of an artist, follower of Antonio Tempesta, with these two agrarian scenes dominated by the zodiac sign. But constellations were also a form of storytelling. We always look for narrative, right? So in a way, Greeks looked at these groups of constellations and unspooled stories from them. And perhaps the most familiar one to us is the story of Andromeda and Perseus. And we have a great example here. Remember the painting from the 1600 of Andromeda and Perseus? Here we have the other one, Flamsteed, another one of the four main star atlases that depicts Andromeda and Perseus. So the story, in case you don't know, Andromeda was the daughter of Cassiopeia. Cassiopeia had apparently bragged about her daughter's beauty to the other gods and goddesses, which was a diplomatic, I guess, no among gods. The gods got angry and asked Poseidon, so the god of the seas, to kill Andromeda. Poseidon sent the sea monster Cetus, who was about to kill Andromeda, who was chained to the rocks. But then Perseus intervenes, riding his winged horse Pegasus, and saves Andromeda. All of these figures are present in the sky. So it was a very fun way to tell a story. I think constellations have a very good historical value in that sense, anthropological value. These stories had at some point some moral and ethical relevance to the people that created them, and continue to do so for centuries. And they're just fun. They're fun to look at, depending on the amount of wine you had that evening, of course. So it's always fun. Well, I would like to conclude. If you feel that you've been kind of all over the place, from one topic to the other, from one world system, theory of world system to another, it's because I think you're supposed to feel this way. We went through a few centuries of huge cosmological discoveries and the impact they had on the collective imagination. So it was never meant to be an easy ride, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will enjoy the exhibit, and thank you all for coming.